How's it going, everyone? This is Kevin. Today I want to bring along with me to show you how to shoot an A7iv. So let's jump right into it. If you're new into the log world, I'm going to share a couple tips and tricks that I use myself, or when it comes down to exposing the A7iv that I use for my A7 IV, my A7S3, and hope they'll help you out. With these methods, it should help you out to properly expose your S-Log footage, as well as getting better with your ISO, range that you're wanting to pick, as well with the white balance, because this is what I do for myself. So why shoot an S-Log? Well, S-Log is meant to be to capture basically the most dynamic range that your camera can do. So that's one of the reasons why you shoot in a flatter profile, so that you can get those highlights and shadows to be a lot better on your camera. This will allow you to get those crispy, nice footage that you want, that most of your YouTubers and cinematography have, because they tend to shoot in a flatter profile to better capture all the dynamic range that your camera allows. And as you currently see right now, I'm gonna put just a flat profile so you can see what it is, why it looks so bland. And the reason why you wanna have it this bland at the beginning is because it helps you get that dynamic range and better just get that color science for your camera to color correct a lot easier, to bring back the saturation, the contrast, and everything like that when it comes down to the post-production of your footage, which sadly can make everything be a little bit harder to tell if you're properly exposing, if you're not used to or you know how to read well enough your S-Log settings. So hopefully these tips will help you out, that we're going to jump into right this second. So the first thing that we're gonna do is go into our, this is the video mode. This is what it looks like with the gamma assist. So I'm gonna go into the briefcase down here, go to display option, the gamma display assist. So if I turn it off, this is what it looks like. That's the flatter profile. If I zoom into that, it looks pretty desaturated and no contrast and light out. But if I go back to the display assist and turn it back on, I'll leave this at auto because it'll pick it for me. If I'm doing S-Log3 or whichever one, it'll just do it for me. And then go back and then look, it looks like it's controlled, but I'm still being able to shoot an S-Log3 whenever it's going into the camera to help me make sure that my exposure is correctly. The gamma assist allows me to use basically more my eye to know if everything's mostly exposed correctly, because I'm seeing it in real time being converted into the Rec 709 without it being converted already, which then allows me to have everything as perfect as possible as I can in camera. So when I'm having to do post editing, it won't be damaging the footage as much with having to bring the exposure up or down and losing the quality, bringing in some noise. And that's the main reason why the gamma assist is just very awesome. Another thing that you can use is the histogram here in the screen. Let's see if we can get it in focus down right there. This allows you to see how well exposed and evenly exposed your footage is, so that way you can make sure that nothing is clipping all the way into the whites, or if the blacks are too into the blacks, and that way you can kind of try to get everything as into the middle as possible to make sure you're evenly exposed as much as you can be. So now another thing to keep in mind is this little plus sign of the manual basically exposure compensation. So if you see the two blinking, it's never the best to have. That means it's a little bit overexposed. So we have two options that we can do, which I try to use either my f-stop to bring it down to make sure it stops blinking, and then keep it around that area where it's maybe a plus 1.7 or the plus 1.3, just to kind of keep it on a safer bet. Or the other one is use a variable ND filter to make sure that I'm going around and just seeing which one is going to bring me to that same plus 1.7 or 1.3. So another thing that we want to keep in mind is these little zebras that we added. So if you go into your menu, it'll be in the exposure color zebra display, and then the zebra level. I did a custom one where I did the lower limit to 94 plus, because it allows me to just make sure that if that is really clipping that much, that means it's really overexposed, just in case of, instead of having at the typical one that it usually comes at. There's just a little minor tweaks that I found online that I thought were helpful, and hopefully it'll help you out to make sure that when you're exposing, you kind of start bringing that down, and then okay, I'm properly exposed. As you see in my histogram, even if it's at a +2 right there, you see how it's not blinking now, then it's not as bad. So that means I can still go a little bit further and then make sure that it's at a plus 1.7. So right here we have how you can see it looks in the histogram, the little exposure compensation where it says plus 1.7. I'm doing a very complex setup right now, trying to hold it there, but I usually try to keep it at a 1.7 plus. If I need to, I can also, you know, like kind of use my f-stop to kind of bring down to a 1.3, or, you know, try to keep the ISO into the native section as much as possible. But that's what it usually looks like straight out of camera with the gamma assist on, so that I can make sure that everything is looking nice and crispy. So now putting it all together, we're gonna take a couple footage of, you know, videos right here using the gamma assist and also the histogram with also the exposure compensation, I guess, number that usually tells you how it's looking, and see what kind of footage we can get real quick. So out of all the exposure compensation kind of methods to make sure that my exposure is correctly, I tend to use the gamma assist the most and just kind of use it by my eye and make sure that everything looks as perfect as I can in camera. And if I need to kind of make sure that, you know, there's more of the scenery, because sometimes if you have a sky or something white behind you, the +2 kind of starts blinking a bit because it's kind of taking everything into consideration. So I tend to then use maybe my histograms a little bit more, or see what other method I can use to make sure that I have the proper exposure. This also allows me to see how my ISO and my white balance is looking. So for the white balance, what I tend to do is I tend to keep it at the 5000 Kelvin, you know, do the manual mode. And if I need to add a little bit more warmth or take some of it out, it's easier to tell with the gamma assist to make sure that everything looks a lot smoother and not be, you know, having the wrong kind of white balance that you can't really fix in post as easily, because you're not shooting raw like how you could with the photography, where you can, you know, be fine with the auto white balance. And if you're using auto white balance, it could shift mid shoot, and you don't want to have that happen either. And as for the ISO, when it comes down to the footage, I always try to keep it as close to the native ISO when I'm shooting in S-Log3. For my A7 IV over here, it's ISO 800, and then for the A7S3 it's 640. Now they tend to have a dual native ISO that's not so dual, and for the ISO for the A7S3 is 12,800, and then for the A7 IV is 3,200 for the S-Log3. This allows me to plan my shots accordingly to my ISO, and also like what kind of exposure compensation I want to have when it comes down to my footage. So that way I'm allowing myself to have the best and closest to my native ISO, so that I'm not losing any quality. It has the best dynamic range and best performance that the camera allows. Every camera is different, but when it comes down to the A7 IV and A7S3, even between those two cameras, you'll notice that they're different ISOs, even for both native or whatever you want to go with. And with that being said, I try not to go above so much from the native ISO. Like even at 1250 is okay, sometimes 2000 depending on which camera I'm using. But when it comes down to having to compensate for more, I try to go into the second native ISO and then adjust with my ND filter to kind of make it darker and kind of bring down the exposure if needed, just to make sure that I'm using the native ISOs to keep the best dynamic range, and since it cleans up the image a lot more as well. These are all my little tips and tricks, you know, I guess, to get my proper exposure with my S-Log3 footage, which you can also use for your S-Log2 footage. Is just depending on how you shoot and when you want to shoot, just accommodate a little bit differently, since S-Log2 to S-Log3 has different, I guess, native ISOs from my I guess memory. I haven't shot S-Log2 in quite a while, but you can use the same tips and tricks when it comes down to with a gamma assist, making sure your histogram is correct, and anything in between that you need to make sure that your exposure is set correctly. These methods have worked well when it comes down to my footage to make them look as cinematic as possible when needed, and make sure that my videos that I'm doing right now always look as crispy as they can be and professional, because always having good visuals and audio can help out your footage to keep growing. So hopefully these exposure compensation methods that I use for shooting S-Log, if you haven't shot S-Log much, will help you out in the long run. So if you have any other questions when it comes down to the S-Log and, you know, exposure compensation, or any tips and tricks that you might be interested in learning that you don't know yet, leave a comment down below and I'd be happy to make a video about it, or even just talk with you on the comments, see how I can help you best out. But with all that said and done, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, share this video with a friend. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.